Welcome to The Big Picture. And on this show, we're going to talk about something that you probably have never heard about before. We like to talk about stories and facts that are interesting and educational. Stay tuned because this is a very, very interesting subject. We're into the football season now, the NFL, Buffalo Bills, Chicago Bears, the Cleveland, whatever they call it now. And there's a story behind the NFL that you don't know about. I would venture to guess not one person in Buffalo, or Western New York for that matter, knows what we're about to talk about. Anyway, this is the subject of what we're going to talk about today. It's a book about Rochester, our neighbors just to the east, and how they were one of the original teams in the NFL. Yes, you got that right. It wasn't Buffalo, it was Rochester was one of the founding members of the NFL. With me today is Jeffrey Miller and John Steffenhagen, who are co-authors of this book. And it tells, this is an encyclopedia. It's unbelievable. It goes through everything that happened in the NFL, basically, and in Rochester from like 1908 to the 1930s. It's fascinating because you haven't heard this before. Anyway, I want to welcome you guys to the show.
Thank you.
It's a fascinating subject, especially now with the NFL season underway and, you know, hundreds of thousands of fans all over the place. Yep. And now it's become a world, you know, venture down in Mexico and in Europe and so on.
Yeah.
But it all started very differently. You know, in this book, we talk about Lyons, who is actually your great-grandfather. And he was just a young guy. He was probably in his late teens, and he was fascinated by football, and he liked to play, and he liked everything about football. And this was back in the early 1900s.
Yeah.
So back then, you just had sandlot teams. You know, basically a group of guys who got together in one neighborhood and played another group of guys in another neighborhood. Tell me a little bit about how that started.
Yeah, well, Leo, the fascinating thing is that Leo started out as this 16-year-old kid who went to school at a Catholic school who forbid pro football or football in any form. So he was obsessed with football even though he was just starting to play it. And as he grew older each year, he was always wanting to start a league. Like I have journal notes of his, and he's saying, you know, I want to start a league. I see pro baseball has a league. Why isn't there a football league? So that would drive him to be obsessed with, at this age, 16, 18 years old, of starting a team and then being in a professional league. And so he follows the steps as he's going, and you can see it as it progresses in the newspapers and through his journal, that here he joins a team. He falls in love with the team in Rochester called the Rochester Jeffersons. They're a sandlot team, strictly amateur. Then he starts to get all the top talent in Rochester, and that leads him to win the state or the city championship. Then he realizes he needs to get the best talent in the state. He actually does that, wins the state championship in 1916, and then the bold move of being a young kid contacts Jim Thorpe in Ohio with his Canton Bulldogs and says, Jim, I think we should start a league. So that would eventually lead to the two getting together to form the NFL.
This is a teenager. We're just doing all this. This is crazy. And this was actually before the George Hallis and even Jim Thorpe and Red Grange, those names that a lot of people might be familiar with. The first names, the first name is Leo Lyons, or one of the first names, and the Jeffersons, they were a neighborhood football team named after Jefferson Avenue or something like that.
Yep. Yeah.
And so that's how it started back then, and you had crowds that didn't know what was going on, and they would come out just out of curiosity, and you would have 300, 400, 500 people attending a game, okay? And even as the league grew, Rochester was going through problems because nobody knew anything about football and nobody had any interest in football. What kind of a challenge was that?
It was a real challenge for Leo because the city itself was more interested in the local guys who came up through the sandlots. So all the players that played during the 1910s, when he tried to join the NFL and started this team, he would recruit college All-Americans. He was trying to get big stars to come in because he thought they would draw tickets. And the people in the city were like, no, we don't want to see these people. We don't want to see the famous guys. We want to see our local guys who we've come to know and love over the last decade. So it was really hard for him to sell this city on pro football.
And there was no internet, there was no television back then, there was no even radio. It was newspapers. And
Exactly.
so getting the word out to people was different than today. I mean, it was difficult to get people to even know what was going on.
That's correct. He had the Democrat and Chronicle in the city of Rochester, but other than that, like you said, there was no radio, no mass media at all. So yeah, it was people in their little localized areas who knew about the Jeffersons, and that was it.
And they had rules at the time. When they did start to get into formalizing these groups, which became leagues, you couldn't have players that were actively in college or even high school with the nobody. So it was just a bunch of amateurs that played, in neighborhood teams. And so that was a challenge as well, because the best talent, which was typically college players, you couldn't approach them even until after they played their last game for the colleges.
Correct.
So the time that we are talking about, 1908, through there was no real formal leagues, right? It was just a whole bunch of teams that were created. And Rochester actually, of all these teams, in the early going, they met with some success. I have something here that you guys brought in. This is a trophy, a Jefferson football team champions of New York State, 1908 to 1916. Mm-hmm. That's quite a quite a memorabilia piece. How did you come to get this?
My uncle who lives in Washington, D.C. Had it. It was one of the pieces he had, and once I started getting involved with all the research I've done the last 20 years and wanted to put a book together, he's like, you know what, I'm going to leave it with you because you have most of his collection now. So
that's fascinating. And part of the thing, and this is an interesting aspect of the story, if you look at this trophy, it looks like a football. Mm-hmm. It looks like the kind of football that we're used to today. Mm-hmm. That's not how it started. What they started playing with looked more like a watermelon than a football.
Called, yeah.
And, Leo actually was one of the guys who came up with the idea that, what, if we streamline the football, we made it a different shape, it would be easier to pass it, to hold it while you're running, to pass it, to kick it. So he came up with this shape along with maybe one or two of the other guys in the league. That was quite.
and he was so bold to have that idea and write it down, document it, and then contact Wilson Football back in 1920, talking about let's change the football, and that's pretty good for a kid. So he gets a hold of George Halas, and they meet at Wilson's factory in Chicago to do the football. But George Halas gets a lot of the credit. Leo just no.
I got to tell you, I cannot imagine Josh Allen throwing a watermelon 60 yards down the field.
Right.
It blows my mind that evolution took place so long ago, and it basically made sense. It was common sense back then.
Well, the forward pass is what really changed the game, because it was basically, in those days, it was like a rugby. It was just scrums, running the football. But when you were able to start throwing the football down the field, it became more exciting, and I think that elevated the fan excitement.
That's interesting. And you know what? We see pictures of old football games. They're all in black and white, and they're all kind of muddy, and it's an image that we have, but they had colors for the uniforms back then. They actually they were a colorful league, and we don't understand that because we never saw that. We don't even know that they had uniforms because you really can't tell that from the pictures. They all look alike. They all look like these dark gray little, shirts and
Yep.
But we have something here. They actually had colors. This is. Do you mind if I open it up?
No, sure.
This is one of the original jerseys.
It's a replica, but yes.
Replica,
Yeah,
Exact
of the Rochester Jeffersons, which is the Jeffs
Name
for short,
Jeffs, yep.
and they wore red. What were some of the other colors in the league?
There were purple and yellows, but the majority, definitely the far majority, was just gray and black. They actually did wear just those, but there were teams that stood out and had the bright colors.
When did they come out with numbers for jerseys?
Numbers?
Well, that
I'm
would have
not-
been later in the late 20s, early 30s.
20s?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Well, I mean, there were jersey numbers all along, but there were some teams that didn't have them at all.
And Buffalo was one of the early teams, but they weren't one of the originals. Rochester was one of the original 10 teams,
Yes.
along with Canton and Akron and Cleveland, and I think Chicago was in there.
Columbus.
Columbus, but Buffalo wasn't in there. But according to the book, and it's fascinating, Buffalo was one of the main rivals, even before the leagues, because when they were sandlot teams, Buffalo had teams, Rochester had teams, and it was a natural that they would go back and forth.
Exactly, yeah. And they actually had some wars over player contracts as well. So there was a heated rivalry.
That was a different. I mean, there was no long-term contracts. There were no, kind of rules. It's like if you could poach a player from another team, just give him a few more bucks, and he'd
they
come over to
did.
your
They
team,
did.
and then maybe he would go back to the other team next week.
They did.
It was to say that it was chaos. That's a little bit understated because basically
Sure.
there were no rules to start with.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Okay, well, we're just about out of time on this segment. I told you it would go fast.
Yeah.
When we come back, we're going to show you a couple of different items, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the evolution of the NFL and how Western New York, Rochester included, was part of that history. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Big Picture. Today we're talking about a book about Leo Lyons and the Rochester Jeffersons. And my guests are Jeffrey Miller and John Steffenhagen, who co-authored this book. And it's a fascinating account of how the NFL started, and part of that NFL start was right here in Western New York in Rochester. Buffalo had a role, but actually Rochester beat Buffalo out to be one of the first teams. Tell me a little bit about Leo, and why did you end up writing this book? That's probably a better question.
Right. I know. I could take hours to explain, but yeah, it all started with my mother and my aunts and uncles going over to his house after he passed away, because his downstairs, as Joe Horgan, the curator of the Hall of Fame, said that his downstairs was the Hall of Fame, basically, before the Hall of Fame. So he had all these, he collected, he was the historian of the league, so he would collect things from the very day one all the way through. So all these things were here. Well, unbeknownst to my mom, his wife, the Hall of Fame contacted her and said, "We're really interested in these items." And so they came, Joe Horgan came with a tractor trailer, and they were loading the stuff up. She'd given it all this stuff. So my mom had several things, a lot of things that were in boxes still. So we had taken those, and I don't know, I think she had them earlier from Leo, but the things that I have now are the things that were taken from
You
them.
decided that this was a fascinating story because you started to learn about all these things.
Which took a long time. These boxes sat in my closet probably for 40 years, because my father was a race car driver. He actually raced here at Lancaster. We were always into racing. I did not like football despite my size. So these things sat there, and I always thought, because I never heard of Leo Lyons, that I figured he was nobody. And these boxes probably had things that were just ordinary household things, that, a uniform and that. But then as I started digging and researching, I contacted Jeff and Ken Crippen at the Pro Football Researchers and delved into it and realized, oh my God, I have the stuff.
Oh, that's interesting. You know, and Leo's name is not mentioned with the Red Granges and the Jim Thorpes and the George Hallases of history, but he played just as much of a part in this. One of the things that kind of took his name and put it into the bookshelves of history is Rochester did not survive as an NFL team. A lot of the teams, Akron, Canton, the Decatur team, there were a lot of teams in the original 10 that they're not there anymore. We still have Cleveland, we still have Chicago. I'm not sure if there's any other original teams, but why did it not survive in Rochester, for instance?
Well, primarily because the NFL made a conscious effort to move to the bigger metropolises. They wanted to be in Chicago, Philadelphia, New York. So the smaller cities like Akron, Dayton, Columbus, they just kind of fell by the wayside because they're only drawing 1,500 to 2,000 people a game. So when the league was growing and you were bringing in people like Red Grange, who came in 1925, they knew that they could sell out 70,000 seats in the Polo Grounds in New York or in Chicago. They weren't going to do that in Akron or Rochester, even though Leo made a concerted effort to sign Red Grange. He thought he could save the franchise. You know, realistically, you had to go where the crowds were going to be.
And he went years and years and years actually cobbling together teams for Rochester, and there was expenses involved and very little return because, as you say, the crowds, especially in Rochester, weren't all that healthy. Mm-hmm. How much I mean, he must have lost money over and over again. And here's a teenager who starts this. You know, there was a little innuendo in the book about organized crime. Mm-hmm. That might be an interesting subject. Yeah. There's a little rumor that he may have got some money from some mobsters to.
Yeah, the money was all along, I believed in reading his journal notes and stuff that he felt that George Eastman was going to get on board and, you know, give him the money that he needed to compete. And it never happened. I mean, he met him several times. But yeah, Leo he worked 3 jobs almost his entire life there. And he paid for everything, the train tickets, the meals, I mean, all the things that you don't think of today, but they're all coming out of his pocket. And he would turn to prohibition, which was happening at the time. So he would associate with that. He lived on the lake, so Lake Ontario to Canada, they smuggled booze and moonshine, you know, through there. So he made money there. He actually had a lot of his players help him do that. And yeah, he would do all kinds of things to try to generate money, and it was tough.
And sometimes the authorities would look the other way.
Yes.
when you know, because prohibition was not the most popular thing in the world, and I think there was kind of an attitude. Just, well, okay, yeah, let's let this slide.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
We have another very interesting. This is a certificate. Tell me a little bit about this certificate.
The certificate, there's only, I believe, a few in existence. The Packers have one. And during the NFL years, the first early seasons, they were issued a certificate of a franchise. And it was signed by the commissioner or president, Joe Carr, Carl Stork, secretary. But that is the original franchise certificate, and that was for the 1923 season.
This is for the National Football League.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is one of the original certificates for a team that was established in the National Football League.
Yeah.
So we're not making this story up. They were one of the original NFL teams. And can you imagine today if Rochester was still an NFL team? The Buffalo Bills wouldn't be around.
Probably not because of territorial issues, but you know, but if they would have been in the NFL and the Buffalo Bills came in from the AFL, I mean, it's possible, but I'm sure the Rochester ownership would have said, no, we're exercising our territorial rights, no Buffalo teams.
What a different world this would be if Rochester had survived in the NFL and become one of the main teams. Just to think about it is kind of blows your mind.
Sure.
there's other elements that you talk about in the book. Now, the book is, like I said, it's an encyclopedia. It has scores. It has records of games, not just in the NFL, but the Sandlot games that preceded that. And where did you get all this information from?
Jeff had a lot of it, and I had a lot of it. Go ahead. You can.
Well, I mean, much of it came from his journal, but the games and the results came from the newspapers at the time, and there was a lot of hardcore research going into it, which John did the majority of. But finding those old scores and finding the attendance.
There were actually financial records?
Financial records. Leo he was an inveterate note taker. He recorded everything. So he's got his ledgers from the early years of how much he lost and how much, what he paid each player. It's all there.
Yeah. And today, the athletes have, the best of all equipment. That wasn't the case back then. Back then, you had cleats that had little nails in the bottom.
Yep.
Exactly.
Tell me a little bit about these shoes.
Yeah, those belong to Henry McDonald. He's a fourth known black player, professional player. And in 1911, he graduated from East High School. And those are his shoes that he actually wore in the 1917 game against Jim Thorpe.
Wow.
So yeah,
that's interesting.
Yeah.
And there was no artificial turf. It was all grass, and sometimes not even grass. It was mud.
Sure.
It was interesting. If you think about high school football today, and even primitive high school football, where they don't have good fields, that's what it was like back then for the pros. I mean, that was literally what it was like. It was just a mud bath.
It was a matter of finding a place to play.
Yeah.
And you just played on a field and put some posts up.
How hard was it to write this book? How long did it take?
It took about 3.5 years. It wasn't really that hard, other than trying to piece it all together, because the journal, Leo's journal, is what we used as the guide, and there were pages missing, or there might be gaps. So I would say to John, we need some information to fill this gap here, and sometimes there would be some, going back and forth, like, I can't find it. And I said, well, we need to fill. We have to have this. So. The cooperation and the collaboration was great, because he gave me what I needed, but it was really just a matter of putting those pieces together as a puzzle.
Now, for the would-be authors out there, you have to go through a process in writing a book. And this particular book is not just stats and figures, and it's about a man. It's about a personality. So you had to balance the subject matter in this book to make it personal, but also tell what happened, to give a feel for how many people, 600 people attended this game, and at the end of this season he was $1,700 in debt, and there's two aspects to this. That was a delicate balance of that.
Yeah, and that was the intention. We didn't want to write a book just about stats and numbers. We wanted to tell the story of what Leo really went through, what he experienced, and the struggles that he faced, so that the reader left with an appreciation of his passion.
And after he basically gave up his dream, and Rochester basically stopped being one of the franchises, what happened to Leo after that?
I don't want to get too much into the book, but yeah, he delved into the paint business. And so somebody from the NFL helped him along. He started a paint business, the Leo V. Lyons Paint Company in Rochester, and he did that as his main job, but he still kept collecting memorabilia from other teams. He would contact teams like the Packers, say, hey, do you guys got some stuff laying around? Because this is back in the 30s and 40s. I mean, nobody thought it was going to be what it is today. So he would just basically be like a junk collector, and that would be the stuff that, the things that I have, like shoes and stuff, things that people would have just thrown away. But he was the one, and then in 1960, all the NFL owners named him the honorary historian of the National Football League because he collected these items.
It's interesting that in 1936 he's the one who actually conceived the idea of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And there are letters that go back and forth between him and Joe Carr, president of the league, in which they talk about establishing a Hall of Fame. But Joe Carr says, we're too young right now. We don't have the money to do that. But
interesting.
Hold on.
And you know what? People may not know, but the early days, the Sandlot days, I mean, there were teams all over the place. You know, and again, they were neighborhood teams. There were teams from Orchard Park and Lancaster and Lockport, and they played teams from Batavia and Rochester. So it's a lot of this is in this book, scores and occasions. You know, sometimes games would be scheduled and the other team wouldn't show up for whatever reason.
Sure.
It's kind of a fascinating account of what happened then when you think about what's happening today. Anyway, we got about 1 minute left. Why would you suggest that people pick up this book?
Well, I think if you're a lover of pro football history, this book gives a different perspective on what we think we know now. The story seems to be told by George Halas and a few other people, but this opens up a whole other view of the league and its founding. So.
Okay, well, here it is. You know, the Leo, Lyons, the Rochester Jeffersons, and the birth of the NFL. I highly recommend it. If you are a football fan, even in passing, if you're a history fan, if you're a fan of interesting personalities, this book kind of covers it all. So I would highly recommend it. And, you know, it's been a pleasure. I want to thank Jeff Miller and John Steffenhagen for being here. I want to thank you guys for watching The Big Picture. We love to give you information that is interesting, but you may have never heard about before. And we're going to do that in the coming weeks as well. We've got some very interesting programs planned. So stay tuned to The Big Picture Prime. Thank you for watching The Big Picture Prime. Thank you for watching WBBZ-TV. We really appreciate it. We're your local station, and we count on you. We'll see you next time on The Big Picture.